Fremzenek Podcast, episode 10. Finally 2 digits. Only took us a few months. And today I'm joined by David V. Johnson. If you'd like to introduce yourself again.
Yes, I'm David Johnson. I think this is maybe my third episode with you guys. Fourth, I'm not sure. I haven't been keeping track, but this one's kind of a special topic because it's one that I wrote about to Fremzenek a while ago. Because I was basically like, here's an interesting topic that I think could be worth going over because I was thinking about it, and I think it's something that could be worth an insightful conversation on.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, we're doing it on the gold standard. And obviously this is your topic, but I think it's worth just going over sort of a history of a gold standard. So I have my notes. I've done some research. So, I mean, the gold standard...
Nice, I do too. I have too.
Yeah. So we can discuss about this. We can sort of take it in turns. But from what I know, the gold standard dates as far back as 600 BC in the Middle East, and it was...
Wait, I need to say, before we talk about the gold standard, let's just talk about what the gold standard is, just to make it clear to the audience, because a lot of people often, confuse it with gold reserves or whatever, and of course they're related, but they're not one and the same. So gold standard is a monetary system in which the standard unit of any economic unit, currency or whatever, is based on a fixed amount of gold. So it's sort of like a fixed exchange rate. It's, literally pegged to gold. And obviously this was done in order to provide stability and encourage investment for people back in the day. Obviously gold was kind of this whole new thing, and I specifically mean in terms of the United States. There was part of the economic boom, I would say, that the United States went through was also due to the fact that it had so much gold on the other side of the country that heavily boosted and propped up their reserve system. Since they adopted it in, I want to say, 1834, they switched from a bimetallic to a straight up gold standard, and that was right around the gold rush. So
I'll just get into like a sort of a spanning back history now. So
as
I was
like
saying,
a century or two.
Yeah, so as I was talking about, the gold standard like originally really dates back from 600 BC in the Middle East, where it was used not only because it was scarce, so it immediately had a sort of inherent value from its scarcity. It also was like very malleable, so you didn't need a very high. It didn't have a very high melting point, so it was very easy to sort of to forge and all of these things, right? And mixed with the scarcity, it was sort of just perfect for coinage. And also because it was gold, it didn't oxidize, it didn't have a shelf life, it just lasted. So I mean that's for example why we don't have iron coins, because iron oxidizes. Silver, it was more abundant, however, and that, as you've mentioned before, there was the bimetallic standard, and silver was used because it could be more sort of liquid in terms of the idea that there was more gold, so it was sort of a good smaller medium of exchange. And in the world
of 15 to 1, I believe.
Yes, I was about to get to that. So in the early 1800s in France, it was 15 to 1, but the Greeks in the early Greek civilizations in a few hundred BCs had a ratio of 20 to 1, which interestingly, if you look at globally, the amount of silver and the amount of gold on Earth, there's about 19 ounces of silver for every 1 ounce of gold. So the Greeks are the closest in history to having it completely perfect in terms of actual physical reserves. But we can get into fiat ratios later, because currently the silver to gold price ratio is 60 to 1. So there's an argument that silver's undervalued. But we're talking about the gold standard here, so we'll move on.
Although I would say bimetallic standards, are just worth briefly going over. I don't know if we're ever going to do like an episode about just bimetallic standards, since they're kind of self-explanatory and no one's really talking about them anymore.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I'll just say this: silver is significantly more volatile than gold. So I think as a result, the bimetallic standard. The gold standard is very, very unlikely to come back, but the bimetallic standard is even more unlikely just because of silver's volatility, as we've seen in the last 2 months. So I mean, it's perfectly timed.
It's the worst of both worlds. You don't have the stability, and you also are pegged to something, and you don't have that sort of, the governments and the central banks don't have the flexibility to, to manage the money supply as much as they would with a completely liquid exchange rate.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that silver is, of course, and gold to an extent, but especially silver with renewables, is in huge demand right now for industrial processes. So yeah,
Yeah. I
um,
mean, there's also a bit of demand for gold, I would say, as
yeah,
well.
I
May
did
may have
mention with
dwindled a bit.
computing and graphics
Yeah.
cards, there is some demand for gold, but silver as a whole has sort of more industrial demand. At least from my research. I mean, I might be wrong. So I'll
No,
move
you're
into
right. You're right.
the modern history. So we already briefly touched on the US, but Britain was the first country to adopt a gold standard in
Yeah, in
1821.
the 18th century.
Yeah, 1821. So it was originally £1 would
Oh, no,
equals.
no. I was actually just going to mention about how it was created by accident by the Royal Mint of England. That's why I said the 18th century.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was getting a little bit of difficulty from feedback on your end, so I assumed you were talking about that. Um,
You can get into that.
but
I was just going to
okay, yeah.
mention
So this,
it was 7.3 grams of gold to the pound, which if you know the current rates is insane. But
yeah. But this was created accidentally by Isaac Newton, who at the time worked with the Royal Mint of England, where he, I can't explain it very well, but um, unintentionally essentially created a gold standard by assuming that gold and silver were like had like a close parity with one another, because as you were
hmm,
saying, it's much it's a much greater deficit between the two.
yes.
But it was accidentally measured as something much greater.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, something much smaller. So the parity ratio was estimated to be, as I was saying, like 15 to 1. Um, and because of that, silver was sort of reduced in circulation, and currencies began being pegged to gold and gold only. And of course, the U.S. Constitution gave Congress the ability to regulate the U.S. dollar's value via a bimetallic standard, but as is the case, the value of silver steadily declined. Um, and yeah, now we move on to the 19th century.
Yeah. So, as I say, Britain was the first one to adopt a true gold standard in 1821 with £1, 7.3 grams. And due to Britain's sort of it was a global hegemon. So it was in one of my episodes I discussed this. It was the global reserve currency. And this is another thing we'll get into is the dollar being pegged to the gold standard and all these other things. But yeah, because the pound was on the gold standard and everyone else had the pound, the gold standard very quickly spread. And by 1870, most economies were using the gold standard. But then it was briefly abandoned during World War One in order to facilitate wartime expenditure. You need these massive spending packages from the government and a huge amount of debt, and you can't facilitate that debt unless you print money. And you can't do that with the gold standard unless you print gold, which is impossible unless you're an alchemist. So then 1925, the UK then readopted the gold standard, but at a significantly higher rate, which hugely overvalued the pound. And, that can be argued to sort of contributed towards the Great Depression with a very strong pound hurting UK exports, but that's a whole other thing. And then in 1931, it was then abandoned due to the Great Depression, because, again, the government suddenly needed a decent amount of money and there was no gold. Because, again, you can't print gold. So then the gold standard did resurge post World War II, however, and this is what I was
What
just talking
system?
about. Yeah, the Bretton Woods system, exactly. So the dollar was pegged to the gold, $35 to the ounce. All global currencies were essentially pegged to the dollar. So the dollar was pegged to gold, currencies were pegged to the dollar. So essentially we had a global gold standard up until 1971 when the US then abandoned the gold standard. And that brings us to today, where the gold standard is really a remnant of the past and everything is fiat currency. And there's some people arguing for a gold standard, but I think as a whole, most people aren't very much in favor.
I mean, there are, of course, notable figures who are in favor of the gold standard.
Hmm,
Obviously, not us, despite our notability.
of course.
But yeah, people such as Judy Shelton, who was Trump's economic advisor during the first term, I believe. was also very vocal about how she wanted to return to the gold standard.
Hmm.
And I believe Shelton was actually nominated by Trump to be part of the Federal Reserve. But naturally, she did not get enough support because I imagine the Federal Reserve wouldn't want someone who would limit their flexibility and their ability to um, shift money supply in case of shocks or what
Hmm.
have you.
Yeah, certainly. Especially with how addicted they are to quantitative easing. That would not
Yeah.
have gone down well in COVID if we had a gold standard.
Oh no, God no.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think we should talk about sort of the different forms of gold standard. We touched on what the gold standard is, but of course there's sort of two main forms. There's full reserve and fractional reserve.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And
So
this also kind of ties back into that episode we did a while ago
on
about
banking,
full
yeah,
reserve and fractional reserve banking. Yeah, it's
exactly.
all linked.
So full reserve, sort of what it says on the tin, right? Every single unit of currency is matched by gold reserves. So, let's say the central bank had, I mean, this is a very low number, but let's say the central bank had 100 grams of gold and each dollar was a gram of gold. You'd have $100 in circulation and that's it. That's the entire economy. So, I mean, just from my description, you can already tell full reserve is not a very smart idea.
No.
So that's why, of course, there's the alternative of fractional reserves. So fractional reserves is only a certain fraction of currency is backed up by a gold reserve. And the way this worked in the US was that, for example, only countries could withdraw their dollars for gold. Individuals could not hold gold. So, if you think about it, only a certain amount of dollars are held by central banks, and most dollars are held by people. So as a result, it sort of automatically created this fractional reserve system because let's say only 10% of dollars were held by banks, so only 10% of dollars had to be backed up by gold. And so as a result, these large institutions trusted gold because trusted the dollar because of a gold standard, and because the big institutions trusted it, the individual people trusted it. So you could still have a fractional system without complete market collapse because of a gold run, for example.
Or, I will say, I feel as though that you bring up a very good point when it comes to consumer confidence. Um, I would say, in general, the gold standard gave a lot of consumers kind of a false sense of confidence
Hmm.
because, again, as you were saying, in crises such as, any war or whatever, in which the government would have to um, manipulate the money supply in order to fight back against shocks that were out of their control, they would have to remove the gold standard. And I
And
feel as though in doing so,
we saw that in World War One and World War Two as we went over. So yeah.
yes, yeah. No, all I was going to say was that I think in doing so, they sort of gave a lot of consumers the false confidence that the gold standard would help prop them up during economic prosperity, but would not be there for them in times of dire need or what have you.
Yeah.
So while I do feel as though that complete liquidity definitely allows for inflation to happen, at a much easier rate. At the same time, it also is able to quickly impose any policies without the need to worry about being enough to cover the amount of gold that because there's a finite amount of gold,
Mm.
but there can be an infinite amount of money. It's just that would result in complete collapse of the economy as we know it. But it's
Yeah.
still something that could be controlled. And as we're saying, unless you worked, as like an alchemist or something, then you can't really like make more gold
Yeah. Of course.
easily.
And so that was I was going to get into the pros and cons of it now. And so obviously the main con is it creates a liquid economy, and the idea that the economy it just lacks liquidity. There's not enough gold necessarily to match output. And now the main argument, the main pro for gold is that theoretically it's deflationary or at least disinflationary. So, money supply is essentially fixed. It can only increase with the supply of gold. And generally, the economic output of a country will grow faster than its increase in gold reserves. So, as a result, the amount of currency you have decreases in the amount of goods and services available. So, the idea is that it's deflationary, right? You could hold on to your dollar, and in 10 years, you could buy equally as much, if not more. However, this comes with the issue of, as I say, illiquidity, right? People aren't going to... People, they want to they're going to want to hold on to their currency so that they can spend it and get more stuff later on. And B, there's just a lack of currency, right? Obviously, there's not a small amount of gold. There's a lot of gold on Earth. There's thousands of tons of gold. But
it's still finite.
Exactly. Even if we had, say, a gram of gold per dollar, that is only a few $1 million or a few $100 million. Nowhere near the trillions that we have in the modern day.
Yeah. And I feel as though the problem is, as the world has become increasingly interdependent on one nation and another, and I would say the problem is the gold standard definitely works if you have much more of a protectionist way of viewing things, economically speaking. But in a world where everything has to be done, very quickly, and every country is interdependent of each other's needs, and there's constant like bailouts and loans and what have you, then I feel as though that fixing it to a finite quantity of something is only going to do it less favors than just having it completely liquid. Although obviously that's pretty much why the gold standard isn't really like seriously talked about being brought back in any shape or form. I feel as though most of the conversations about bringing the gold standard back or having like a completely fixed exchange rate to a specific quantity of resources is finite. It is very minimal compared to those that believe in a complete form of liquidity and free floating exchange.
Or in at the very least, if there is talk about, say, hard currency, it's more about crypto in the modern day, and that's for many reasons, and we have discussed it before.
That's a whole other can of worms. But I feel as though it being completely decentralized and not backed up by anything is kind of, it's like the complete antithesis to everything the gold standard stands for. Yes. It's they're polar opposites, but it's like the North and the South Pole, or like anarchism and fascism. They're two wildly different things, yet they're both at the ends of the same line. So on one hand, you have something that's completely dependent on centralization to the point where it doesn't fluctuate in value. It can't really be manipulated or used in any way. And then on the other hand, you have something that can literally change its value from a tweet.
But equally so, both are hard currencies with a fixed supply.
That is a very good point, because you have your blockchains and your data centers that are constantly mining and pumping out all these currencies. And I think in doing so, that's definitely going to lead to more conversations about whether all this mining is sustainable or not, because I don't think it is, and the extent to which something that could be promised as infinite actually has much more of a limited shelf life, so to say.
Well, the point about Bitcoin, for example, is that Bitcoin reserves come in tranches. So every 5 or 10, I believe it's every 5 years, new Bitcoins are available to mine. But by 2100 something, there will be no more Bitcoin available to mine. And so the idea is that eventually we'll run out, much like how gold eventually will run out of gold to mine. Again, parallels, just interesting. But I'll get to another point about the gold standard. So as we were just discussing about the interdependence of economies, is that the gold standard, if everyone adopted the gold standard, we would have a stable exchange rate, right? So currencies would all correspond to the same tangible asset, obviously gold. And as a result, you couldn't, say, like China's doing, purposely undervalue your currency to make your exports more competitive. If we were like on the Bretton Woods system, like we were before, where essentially everyone was on the gold standard, you couldn't undermine each other's currencies, and as a result, you could only trade in arguably the good's true value, not the fiat currency value that each country assigns to its goods. So, I mean, yeah, so this would stop export dumping. That's another benefit of a gold standard. But, of course, this relies on the fact that every single country adopts the gold standard, which China doesn't want to do that. They don't want to give up their export benefits. And, I mean, certainly other countries like the UK and the US, they don't want to adopt the gold standard because they've hugely benefited from fiat currencies.
But no, I was just going to say, I think the world has become much more different than it was 200 years ago. So I feel as though it'll be much harder for countries to come together and figure out what is the value of gold as it is today in 2026 relative to their currencies, because that's just going to be a nightmare to work out and to figure out exactly the extent, like the whole thing was just an accident from I'm the modern well, I don't want to say modern because it's not really around anymore, but like the in the 18th century when the ratio was miscalculated, I would say, and again this goes back to what you were saying, I would say that sort of led us onto a collision course where we overestimated the value of gold and its usage and how it could be utilized in situations like this, if I'm making sense.
Yeah, and again, as I say, I mean, even 100 years ago, right? The reason we had a sort of a global gold standard from a Bretton Woods system was World War II, which ultimately meant the US was sort of, again, the real global hegemon. It's you really need an extraordinary event for something like global recognition of a certain currency standard to happen. And I mean, I'm not saying we need a World War III. I'm saying we probably shouldn't have a World War III. And again, I'm in favor of fiat currency, so by no means am I advocating for World War III to bring back the gold standard. But if you were to imagine the gold standard to come back, it would most likely be through a horrible event such as a huge depression or a war or something or other.
Although a lot of people say that our central banks are way too stable to have something like a second Great Depression happen again, or a recession or whatever. But I would say I would contend otherwise because you know take for instance stuff such as the Great Recession, which was kind of more of an issue of pure liquidity.
On bad loans.
Yeah,
and
and
such.
bad loans. And again, we talked about this in the collateralized debt obligations episode. Um, you expand, you print out all this money, you expand the bubbles, such as the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, and, I would say this being kind of speculative, but what we're seeing now with the AI bubble, you're expanding that all the way until it's too much, and in doing so, everyone that was putting themselves and investing into that just completely, is affected heavily, and in doing so that I don't want to say trickles down because that has much different connotation, but it's a ripple effect. It affects all the other people.
A domino effect, I would say. One
Yeah,
domino
you could say
falls and
domino
all the
effect.
others fall. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean even
Although
the,
again,
the
the
Great
domino effect
Depression.
also has kind of another connotation to it, but
that,
that's more communist.
Yeah, as we were
Yes.
saying with the Great Depression, that wasn't even necessarily a liquidity crisis. That was caused by people being too invested in the stock market and eventually overvaluing it. That wasn't necessarily an illiquidity issue, although.
No, I said recession, didn't
Yeah,
I?
I know. I was just getting back to the Great Depression, and I'm
Yeah.
sort of bringing it back to the idea that the Great Depression was spurred on significantly by wealth inequality, which
Yeah.
cough cough.
I'm seeing a lot of that right now. So, wake up, people.
Yeah, no, I just thought it was funny because, as you said, people don't believe another Great Depression can happen because of how stable our institutions are. But it doesn't matter how stable your institutions are when wealth distribution is, really leaning towards one person rather than everyone.
That
I'll do
creates
one more.
imbalance.
I'll do one more Steelman pro of the gold standard. So there's the argument that it makes governments more fiscally responsible, just automatically, because the idea is that you can't immediately just deficit spend. You, of course, need to bring in more gold, or even if it's a fractional gold system, you still need some gold to come into the government in order to spend a deficit. And so, as a result, you have a fiscally responsible government that doesn't overspend and cause inflation, or spend willy-nilly and end up with a roads to nowhere, as we saw in Japan in the other episode.
Yeah.
But I think this is ultimately a con, because if the government can't, I mean, yeah, maybe in times of economic boom, as Keynes argues, the government will just automatically want to cut back in order for it to run a surplus to purchase gold. But equally so, in terms of recession, the government can't really spend a deficit, and so then you're stuck in a recessionary cycle. So, as I say, it peaks and troughs, pros and cons. It's I would say overall it's a net negative, because yes, it works as a good guardrail in times of economic boom, and you could take a Keynesian perspective and say, oh, it automatically means the government runs a surplus and cuts back, because this is the issue with Keynes, I believe. He says we need to spend during deficit, but then cut back during times of economic boom. But we don't. We see one, but we don't see the other. And I'm sure you know which one we aren't seeing.
Well, I mean, I will also say to that to that extent that putting way too much trust in these gold reserves and in the gold standard actually has the opposite intended effect, because as you were saying, the gold standard was kind of meant to be completely deflationary, for good or for worse. um, but I think in just spending more than their gold reserves could back, then that's only going to lead to greater inflation. And I feel as though the same could sort of be said with any other form of centralization or backing,
Hmm.
where if you put way too much stock into something, I mean stock like metaphorically, but if you if you invest and engage so much with something and you stretch it beyond the limits of what's possible, then you're only going to do the inverse of what it's intended to do, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And
No, I agree.
yeah,
I think, yeah, because that's the other thing is, let's say you want to increase the money supply, and in order to do that, you need to devalue your currency in relation to gold. Unless you perfectly line up your gold devaluation with the increase in money supply, um, it's going to cause some overvaluation or undervaluation, and as a result, there's all these other things, and that's another argument against the gold standard, especially in terms of it being a centralized thing. You have to rely on a central bank perfectly being able to line up its increase in money supply with its decreasing gold values, and all of these other things. And there's a whole debate to be had about that. And then there's also the argument that sort of defeats the purpose of the gold standard, because of course the idea of a gold standard is that, as you said and as I said before, it's meant to be deflationary, but in that case it isn't.
yeah.
Hmm.
What was I gonna say? I was gonna say something else. I lost my train of thought there. Um, oh yeah. No, I will say though. Just a question. Do you think hypothetically, if somehow, like miraculously, and this is just purely hypothetical, we found like the city of El Dorado, or we were able to find a plethora of more gold,
Hmm.
would you think that would be means to bring back the gold standard or not?
Okay, so I have two answers for this. Number one, we can look historically and talk about when Spain found the New World, and they were influxed with silver and gold from the Incas, from the Aztecs, from the Olmec, not Olmecs. So my mind escapes me now. But yeah, the Spanish
I know what you
found the
mean.
New World, and they found a lot of silver and a lot of gold. And ultimately, what happened is that flooded the market and devalued all their currencies. And
Yeah.
now, arguably, you could say that was good. It allowed more liquidity and all these other things, but equally so, it devalued it so much that, and Spain was sort of, it had so much gold and silver that it essentially became worthless, and as a result, Spain really suffered. I researched this quite a lot a while ago, so I don't know all the exact details, but it was certainly a net negative. And that was when they used silver and gold to mint coins. So you had essentially a de facto bimetallic standard. And now I have a
Yeah.
second idea. So you use the example of El Dorado, but there is a very real, tangible event that could be upcoming in the next 50 years where we do have that asteroid mining, right? There's an asteroid that has more gold on it than all of Earth several times over. We could go mine that asteroid and get tons and tons and tons of gold.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking like extraterrestrially. I completely forgot that was a thing.
Yeah, and that is something we could very tangibly see in the next 50 to 100 years. There is a
Yeah.
lot of talk about asteroid mining, and I think even then, I don't really see a point in adopting a gold standard. I think if we're asteroid mining, we'll be so technologically advanced. You know, there's that book, Luxury Space Communism. If we're
Yes.
asteroid mining, we're either going to have horrible, horrible, extreme capitalism, or we're going to have luxury space communism. So yeah, again, I think a gold standard, I mean, you can argue we could have a gold standard as a means of distributing wealth, through having everyone get a gold dividend, a citizen's gold dividend. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Like,
communism.
an entitled amount of gold.
Yeah, but then essentially you're just doing a universal basic income, which you can do on a fiat currency. Or
Yeah.
if we do
Hell, you could.
a true
Yeah.
communist society, there's no currency,
Yeah.
So yeah,
But in doing so, you have no incentive to work, and when you're in space, that's going to be really hard to do because it kind of, it's the whole intention is to progress as much as possible and to encourage adaptability. And if there's no incentive for any of those things, then I'm just saying, I know that this isn't a sentence I ever thought I would say, but I don't think space communism is a good idea. But
well, it's the idea is that it's fully automated, so it uses AI and space technology and all of these other things. So it's not post scarcity, but it's post labor is what I like is the way I like to describe it.
I mean, yeah, but then we're just gonna be like those people in Wall-E, where we
Yeah.
won't have any reason to like work or anything. We would just constantly, and we would loop back around to the issues with capitalism, where it's just constant, sometimes consumption, and constant like, um, consumerism,
Yeah.
and yeah.
No, yeah, I
But
would
again, it's
agree
all
with that.
speculative.
Yeah, again, this is all. Yeah, the idea of finding an infinite amount of gold, and I mean, we can harken back to my Spain example. Is Spain arguably suffered because it was on the gold standard and it found a lot of gold and it caused so much liquidity that currency essentially became worthless, or at least worth very, very little into what it used to be. So I would argue if we did start asteroid mining and we didn't have fully automated luxury space communism, that we would stay on a fiat currency and instead just let gold and silver prices crash. And then now we
Yeah.
have the benefit that we have a lot of cheap gold, a lot of cheap silver, and now we can go use that to produce loads of solar panels, loads of computing chips, loads of whatever we use gold and silver for in industrial processes, because it is surprisingly wide stretching. So, yeah.
We wouldn't have to waste it, for lack of a better word, on putting it entirely in a gold reserve and hoarding it.
Yeah, but the hundreds of tons of gold under the Bank of England and the New York Stock Exchange and all of these things they could go to Taiwan and be used for chips rather than as I say sitting in as a gold bar under some several 100-year-old building.
Yeah.
Hmm. So I mean, okay, to succinctly answer your question, if we suddenly found ourselves with infinite amounts of gold, no, we probably still wouldn't adopt the gold standard simply because we could use it for more useful industrial purposes and,
Yeah.
just adopt a different. I mean, we could stay on fiat currency. We could, we can get into the discussion about adopting crypto. We could even talk about, say, with automation, for example, the big driver of value would be energy. And we're seeing that nowadays with AI even. Energy is really the driver of every modern economy. You look at a graph, energy consumption to GDP per capita, it's almost a linear line. There's
Yeah.
some outliers, of course, but yeah, nonetheless.
Directly
Um,
proportional.
yeah. So, and I mean, this is sort of getting into some more politics, but there was the idea by technocrats, as they call themselves, technocracy. They argued that currency should be measured in energy output. So you'd have energy credits, and every megawatt hour of energy produced by the state would then be distributed to individuals, and they can spend their energy tokens wherever they want. and the amount of energy it took to produce an item, they'd be proportional, and then you have sort of a true valuation of everything based on energy output. And with robotics and automation and things, you no longer have to factor in labor hours or whatever, or the resource
So it's just
costs.
completely automated, instead shifting the focus on energy.
Exactly, because as I say,
Yeah.
with automation, you don't even need to factor in the resource costs because we're mining asteroids or whatever. And I mean, this was in the 1920s. The technocrats were surprisingly ahead of their time, although
Yeah,
equally
surprisingly.
equally as regressive in some aspects.
Yeah, we didn't
Um,
even have talking pictures back then.
but yeah,
Um,
nonetheless, the technocrats' idea of energy tokens is certainly interesting. I feel like that's the more obvious alternate currency if we were to go down that route.
but the problem is, in the technocrats hypothetical, is that there's so many factors at play here. Like, oh, we're going to be mostly automated. We're going to have asteroid mining, and I feel like that's just so far ahead in the future that it shouldn't really be a concern at the moment. Um, like it'll come when it comes, but we're putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. And I feel as though it's sort of the same thing with cryptocurrency in a way, where we're putting so much energy and we're using so many resources on something so incredibly volatile.
Hmm.
I
Um,
actually just sent an article over as well that I had looked through. That was pretty cool. Um,
right.
and I think could definitely, that was the one I was talking about earlier, like off the mic. Um, you
Hmm.
know,
We can
so
discuss this. I did mention the Great Depression earlier,
yeah,
so we can go back to that and start discussing that. So
yeah,
so
because
I haven't
I
read this,
did
of
want to talk
course.
about the
So
extent.
if you want to give a quick synopsis and
Yeah,
what your views
all
and
right.
everything, go ahead.
So basically, I didn't read the entire thing, but I read most of it. So I hope I'm not penalized for that, or some academic centers don't like blacklist me or anything.
The Fremzenek Podcast
But
is very, very prestigious. So
yeah, we're very prestigious. We shouldn't. We have a lot of credit here. Um, that said, what it basically does is it tries to examine. This was written in 1997, and what it does is it examines the extent to which the gold standard was responsible for the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed.
I did mention that.
Yeah, yeah, but obviously, I would say, from my perspective, and from reading this, I would say, obviously, putting so much strain on a system that doesn't really allow for much flexibility. Oh, sorry about that. Was naturally going to result in a crash, and but it's not the only thing. Obviously, there were, as you were saying, with the stock markets, and you were just putting so much expenditure, so much energy into something that was kind of volatile
And
in the stock
completely
market's case.
intangible at the same time, right? The stock
Yeah, and
market
also,
simply shares.
yeah, the stock market was just shares, and then the gold standard, you were doing the things you should be doing with non-tangible things to something that is tangible, and because of that, you're stretching it beyond the limits of what is possible,
Hmm.
and thus it kind of breaks the currency. It's like when you're stretching an elastic band so far, and you just you like involuntarily let go, and it snaps your hands a little bit, and it hurts. That's what happened.
Yeah. So, I
Yeah.
mean, sort of unrelated quote, but I mean, just sort of interesting. Just as you were talking about, it came to mind is of course Keynes' quote: "Anything we can actually do, we can afford." Um, and it's sort of the exact opposite of that. Is anything is we tried to afford so much that we simply couldn't do it anymore, and the entire system collapsed. So the complete
Yeah,
opposite
well,
of
he
what
also
Keynes
encouraged
observed.
spending during deficits.
Of
So,
course, of
I
course.
respect Keynes as much as the next guy, but I don't agree with all of his things. I mean, obviously, he's a world-renowned economist, and I'm just
Hmm.
me. But I feel as though some people shouldn't really be taking Keynes' ideas so like to heart nowadays, especially because the world was much more different back then.
I mean, he
Also, I
advocated for an abandonment of a gold standard. That was very ahead of its time.
yeah, it was ahead of his time, but I would say one issue I have with his words is that he constantly dismisses the importance of the long run. And he constantly says, "Oh, in the long run, we're all dead. Nothing matters. You got to spend now, um, and save during growth and all that." And I feel as though that's not as applicable today because the world is so much more different. And I feel as though that
And that's the other thing.
we are,
He looked at it as purely an economist, and I
yeah,
mean, not just an economist, sort of a mathematical economist. He never factored in the other side of economics, which is it's a social science. You need to look at the social aspect, and of course, as I described before, right? Socially, in terms of economic prosperity, we aren't ever going to cut back and stop spending. We're just going to continue spending because we suffer from myopia and all of these other things, right? So Keynes' argument to cut back in terms of economic good times, it just doesn't happen because of human nature, and I feel that's his biggest failure.
I mean, that said, of course, if the ghost of John Maynard Keynes, is listening, I respect the piss out of you. So
Yeah,
don't you worry
he
about.
advanced the
Yeah,
field of economics a lot.
yeah.
Um,
There's a reason
but
why
there's only
he has
so
an
much
entire
you can do in your
subfield.
day because you simply don't know what's going to happen in 100 years' time, as we're seeing now.
Yeah. So I would say my problem is less with Keynes himself because he's great, but more so with people kind of misinterpreting his words and twisting them in order to encourage more immediate spending rather than uh, than saving for investment in the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of that can be even observed today, right? You see companies, they see record-breaking profits, and they immediately put it into stock buybacks, and
Yeah.
there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as though part of it also comes from impulse and human nature, where, and again, I know it's ironic considering that, as you were saying, Keynes didn't really factor in a lot of the social aspect, but many times humans would just like a trigger finger and like immediately do something without really thinking about it because they're scared about what would happen if they don't take advantage of it. And I feel as though that part of economics is having uh, to come to terms with both the rational and the instinctual parts of your brain to come to sort of a consensus on decision making, so to say. Um, and I feel as though that if you sort of relegate all those ideas somewhere else and you just primarily focus on immediate spending and immediate satisfaction and immediate distraction, then in doing so, you're only going to hurt yourself even more, so to say.
Yeah, no, agreed.
Yeah, we're not being
Yeah,
very
so
argumentative
no,
today,
again, yeah,
or in
it's just,
general.
I agree. I think, of course, Kalecki was almost, he had similar ideas to Keynes, but he was almost more left wing than Keynes, and as a result, he did argue for socialism and these other things, and he did. Like Keynes, he did actually put some of his theories to work. Like with Keynes, we saw him work on the New Deal. Kalecki worked with various countries. I forget. I think India was one of them, and the other countries, and it was just very interesting. So I'd like to know if you have any criticism of Kalecki that sort of differ from your criticisms of Keynes.
Well, I mean, I would say most of my criticisms still apply to an extent, but again, it's not criticisms towards them. I would just want to clarify not only to the audience, but
To
also
his ideas, I meant
to
to his
well,
criticisms
no,
of
to
his
his
ideas.
ideas, not necessarily. I don't. First of all, I don't, and this might be a little bit self-deprecatory. I don't feel as though I, of all people, am in a position to critique their ideas, because what they basically stated kind of laid the foundations of modern economics as we know it, and moved away from a lot of the rigid thinking that came with classical economics. Moved to a much more, I don't want to say enlightened, but it broadened people's understanding of what economics could be a lot more. But I also feel as though part of what they've said has sort of just been turned into like pithy phrases that people could use to justify, um, irresponsible spending or what have you. If you catch my drift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Um, yeah, I mean that's what I like to hear. Yeah.
But we've
So
sort of derailed off of a gold standard. We could pick up
yeah.
a further discussion about various economists later on. But yeah, I think that's a good
Yeah.
end point. We had a nice little
Although I think
discussion
we
at the
pretty
end
much
here.
exhausted everything we could about the gold standard.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've pretty much
You
talked
sort of
about it.
either
I'm looking
agree with
through my
it or you
notes.
disagree with it.
Yeah.
We laid out the pros and
Yeah.
cons, and you could form your
Yeah.
opinion based
Just
on that.
just to make it clear, it worked well for the time, but it had its limits, and it is never going to work in a million years if we bring it back.
Not in the modern
So,
economy, no.
yeah, and even if we did somehow bring it back, there are much better ways and much better applications of it. And that's why I asked the hypothetical earlier, just because I thought it would be interesting to see, how, humanity and the economy would react
Hmm.
to a sudden abundance of resources, um, and how that would change their way of valuing their currencies. Um, and obviously, I had a consensus in my mind, but I wanted to know what you thought because I thought that makes for interesting and thought-provoking discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean ultimately globalization killed the gold standard. And thanks for watching.